October 25, 1944. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea like a blade cutting through silk. The water was dark, almost black in the early light, its surface disturbed only by the churning wakes of warships moving into formation. Aboard the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing barely 2,100 tons, Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge and tasted salt in the air. The horizon stretched empty before him, but he knew what lay beyond it. Somewhere to the north, the largest battleships ever constructed by human hands were bearing down on his position. Their guns could hurl shells the weight of automobiles across distances measured in miles. His own vessel, thin-hulled and lightly armored, carried torpedoes and 5-inch guns that seemed almost trivial by comparison. The men around him were quiet, their faces drawn tight with the knowledge that had been passed down through the fleet. During the night, the Japanese center force had been spotted. Yamato was coming. The sound that defined that morning was not the thunder of guns, not yet. It was the steady thrum of turbines, the mechanical heartbeat of a ship built for speed rather than protection. The Johnston vibrated beneath Evans's feet like a living thing, responsive to every command, eager despite the mathematics of destruction that governed naval warfare. In the cramped compartments below, men checked ammunition feeds and torpedo mounts with the practiced efficiency of those who had trained for this moment without ever quite believing it would arrive. They were sailors of the United States Navy, volunteers and draftees alike, many of them barely old enough to vote. They served aboard a ship the Japanese had long ago designated with a term that mixed contempt with tactical assessment, a tin can, fragile, expendable, useful only for escort duties and submarine screening, not meant to stand in the line of battle against capital ships. But dawn was breaking, and the mathematics of war were about to be tested by something that could not be calculated on plotting boards or predicted by the careful analysis of naval strategists. The men of Taffy 3, the escort carrier group that Johnston and her sister destroyers were assigned to protect, were about to write a chapter in naval history that would be studied for generations. They would do it in vessels the enemy had laughed at, ships built cheap and fast in American shipyards that operated around the clock, welded together by workers who had never built warships before. The destroyers were indeed thin-skinned, their plating barely sufficient to stop shrapnel, let alone armor-piercing shells fired from 14-inch guns. They were tin cans in the most literal sense, constructed of steel so thin a man could dent it with a sledgehammer. And yet, in the waters off Samar Island, they would become something else entirely. To understand what happened in those desperate hours off Samar, one must first understand the profound contempt with which the Imperial Japanese Navy viewed American destroyers. In the opening years of the Pacific War, this was not mere arrogance, though arrogance certainly played its part. It was rooted in a tactical doctrine that had been refined over decades, a philosophy of naval warfare that prized the decisive battle between heavy units above all else. The Japanese had built their fleet around the concept of the Kontai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement in which battleships would close to medium range and pound each other into submission while cruisers and destroyers provided screening and support. In this paradigm, destroyers were auxiliary vessels, useful for launching torpedo attacks under cover of darkness or smoke, but never meant to engage capital ships in daylight combat. Japanese naval officers studied the American destroyer force with the cold eye of professionals, assessing an opponent's weaknesses. What they saw confirmed their prejudices. American destroyers of the 1930s and early 1940s were indeed lightly built, emphasizing speed and range over armor protection. The Fletcher-class destroyers that would become the backbone of the U.S. Navy's destroyer force during the war displaced only 2,100 tons, compared to the Japanese Fubuki-class destroyers, which displaced nearly 3,000 tons and carried more powerful torpedo armament. The American vessel seemed to embody everything Japanese naval strategists believed was wrong with American military thinking. They were mass-produced rather than carefully crafted, designed for economy rather than excellence, built in quantities that suggested their builders expected them to be lost in combat. The term tin can was not originally a Japanese invention. American sailors themselves had adopted it as an affectionate nickname for their destroyers, acknowledging their ship's vulnerability while taking pride in their speed and agility. But when Japanese intelligence officers translated captured American documents and monitored radio communications, they seized upon the term with a different meaning. Tin cans, disposable containers, ships so weakly constructed that a single hit from a cruiser's guns might blow them in half. In the officers' messes of Japanese battleships and cruisers, The American destroyer became a subject of dark humor. Stories circulated of how American destroyers would flee at the first sight of a real warship, how their crews lacked the fighting spirit necessary for close combat, how their thin hulls could be penetrated by machine gun fire. These stories were exaggerations, but they rested on a foundation of truth. American destroyers were vulnerable. Their armor could not protect them from heavy shells. In a straight gunnery duel with a cruiser, let alone a battleship, they had no chance of survival. What Japanese officers failed to understand was that American naval doctrine had never intended destroyers to fight such duels. The American destroyer force had been designed for a different kind of war, one that emphasized flexibility over fixed doctrine, initiative over rigid adherence to battle plans. American destroyers were meant to hunt submarines, to screen carrier task forces, to lay smoke and launch torpedo attacks and withdraw before enemy capital ships could bring their guns to bear. They were built in massive numbers not because their designers expected them to be easily destroyed, but because American industrial capacity allowed for mass production of complex weapon systems on a scale the Japanese could scarcely imagine. By 1944, American shipyards were launching destroyers at a rate of one every week. Entire classes of vessels were conceived, designed, built, tested, and deployed in the time it took Japan to construct a single heavy cruiser. The Japanese looked at this industrial tsunami and saw confirmation of American weakness. They saw quantity without quality, mass without excellence. They failed to grasp that quantity itself could become a form of quality, that the ability to build 20 destroyers for every battleship fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of naval warfare. More critically, they failed to understand the men who would crew those tin cans. American destroyer sailors were volunteers and draftees drawn from every corner of a continental nation. Farm boys from Iowa and mechanics from Detroit, college students and factory workers unified by training that emphasized individual initiative and technical competence. They were not samurai. They did not subscribe to the cult of the decisive battle or the philosophy of death before dishonor. They were pragmatic, irreverent, and possessed of a democratic skepticism toward authority that Japanese officers would have considered mutinous. And yet, when the moment came, these men would prove capable of acts of courage that matched anything in the annals of naval warfare. The Japanese expected to fight a war of annihilation. Their opening moves in December 1941 seemed to confirm that their strategy was sound. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated the vulnerability of battleship-centric doctrines to carrier-based air power. The sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya had proven that even the most modern capital ships could be destroyed by aircraft. In the early months of the war, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and the Pacific with a speed that shocked Western observers. American, British, and Dutch naval forces were overwhelmed. At the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, an Allied fleet that included cruisers and destroyers was decimated by Japanese surface forces. The tin cans that survived limped back to port with stories of Japanese night fighting prowess and the devastating power of the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. These early victories reinforced every prejudice Japanese naval officers held about American fighting quality. The Americans, it seemed, could not stand up to the Imperial Navy in surface combat. Their destroyers were too weak, their crews too green, their tactics too cautious. When American vessels did show aggression, as they had during some of the confused night actions in the Java Sea, they paid for it with their survival. The pattern seemed clear. American destroyers would flee or die. There was no third option, but the Americans were learning. Every defeat carried with it lessons that were studied, analyzed, and incorporated into new tactics and training programs. American naval officers examined action reports from Java Sea and the early Solomons campaign and drew conclusions that would reshape their approach to surface warfare. They learned that Japanese optics and training gave enemy forces a significant advantage in night combat, so they developed radar systems that allowed American ships to detect and track targets in complete darkness. They learned that Japanese torpedoes outranged American torpedoes by a substantial margin, so they adapted their tactics to emphasize closing speed and smoke screens. Most importantly, they learned that aggression, even suicidal aggression, could disrupt Japanese battle plans and create opportunities for victory. The Solomon Islands campaign became a crucible in which American destroyer tactics were tested and refined. In the narrow waters around Guadalcanal, American tin cans fought a series of brutal night actions against Japanese cruisers. and destroyers attempting to reinforce and resupply Japanese forces on the island. These battles were chaotic. Confused affairs fought at point-blank range in darkness broken only by gun flashes and searchlight beams. American destroyers were sunk. The USS Cushing, Laffey, Barton, Monson, the names accumulated like a roll of honor, each one representing a ship blown apart in the night. Men burned alive or drowned in waters fouled with oil and blood. But the Japanese paid too. At the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, American destroyers charged into a superior Japanese force and inflicted damage far out of proportion to their size. The battleship Hai was crippled and later sunk. Cruisers were damaged. The Japanese force withdrew. The pattern repeated itself throughout 1943 and into 1944. American destroyers learned to fight with a ferocity that belied their thin hulls. They learned to use their speed, to lay smoke screens that blinded enemy optical rangefinders, to close to point-blank range and launch torpedoes before withdrawing into the darkness. They learned that aggressive action, even when tactically disadvantageous, could impose hesitation on an enemy who expected them to flee. Japanese naval officers began to report strange behavior from American destroyers. The tin cans were not fleeing. They were attacking. Sometimes they attacked when any rational calculation suggested they should withdraw. This was troubling because it introduced an element of unpredictability into combat, and unpredictability was the enemy of the carefully orchestrated battle plans that Japanese doctrine favored. Still, in October 1944, as Japanese forces prepared for what they hoped would be a decisive battle in the Philippines, there remained a fundamental confidence in the superiority of Japanese capital ships. The Americans might have learned to fight more aggressively, but they were still sailing in vessels that could be destroyed by a single well-aimed salvo from a battleship's main guns. The mathematics remained unchanged. A destroyer displacing 1,000 tons could not sink a battleship, displacing 65,000 tons. The armor belt of Yamato was 16 inches thick. The 5-inch guns of American destroyers could not penetrate it. The battle would be decided by the big guns, as battles had always been decided since the age of sail. The tin cans might make nuisances of themselves, but they could not alter the outcome. This confidence was about to be tested in waters off Samar Island, in a battle that would become known as the last stand of the Tin Can sailors. The Japanese center force that emerged from the darkness on the morning of October 25, 1944, was a weapon of staggering power. At its core were 4 battleships, Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna. These were not ordinary capital ships. Yamato and her sister ship Musashi were the largest battleships ever constructed, mounting 9 18-inch guns capable of firing shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds to a distance of over 25 miles. The armor protection of these vessels was correspondingly massive. Yamato's main belt was 16 inches thick, her turret faces 26 inches. She had been designed to withstand hits from 16-inch shells, the largest guns mounted on American battleships. No American destroyer carried weapons capable of seriously threatening such a vessel. Accompanying the battleships were 6 heavy cruisers Haguro, Chikai, Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, and towing each displacing over 10,000 tons and mounting 8-inch guns. The light cruisers and 11 destroyers completed the force. In aggregate, the center force represented one of the most powerful surface fleets assembled by any nation. During the war, commanding this force was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, a veteran officer who had fought in nearly every major naval engagement of the Pacific War. Kurita was not given to illusions. He knew that his force had been battered during its passage through the Sibian Sea the previous day, where American carrier aircraft had sunk the battleship Musashi and damaged other vessels. He knew that American submarines had torpedoed cruisers during the night transit of the San Bernardino Strait, but he also knew that his orders were explicit: penetrate into Light Gulf and destroy the American invasion fleet anchored there. The troop transports, the supply ships, the infrastructure of amphibious warfare, all of it was vulnerable to the guns of his battleships and cruisers. If he could reach the Gulf, he could inflict a catastrophe on American forces that might alter the course of the Philippine campaign. What Kurita did not know, what Japanese intelligence had failed to discern, was that the American force guarding the northern approach to Light Gulf was not a fleet carrier task force. It was Taffy 3, a unit of escort carriers and destroyers so small and lightly armed that it would not have been considered a primary target under any conventional assessment of naval priorities. The escort carriers Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Cullinan Bay, Kickham Bay, and Gambier Bay were converted merchant hulls, slow and unarmored, carrying fewer than 30 aircraft each. They had been designed for anti-submarine warfare and close air support of ground forces, not fleet combat. Their escorts were 3 destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Herman for destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond. Together, these 7 vessels displaced less tonnage than a single Japanese heavy cruiser. When Kurita's lookout spotted the distinctive mass of American carriers on the horizon, shortly after dawn, the admiral and his staff initially assumed they had encountered the main American carrier force. This was the target they had been seeking, the decisive engagement that would justify the losses they had suffered. Orders were issued. The fleet increased speed. Gun crews closed up at battle stations, in the plotting rooms of Japanese battleships. Fire control officers calculated range and bearing to the enemy carriers. The mathematics were simple. Close to effective gun range. Launch salvos. Destroy the carriers before their aircraft could mount effective strikes. The thin-skinned escorts would flee or be swept aside. This was the moment Japanese naval doctrine had been designed to achieve. Aboard the American ships, the realization of what they faced arrived with the cold precision of radar returns and visual identification. The officer of the deck on USS Fanshawe Bay, staring through binoculars at the pagoda-like masts that had appeared on the horizon, uttered words that would be remembered for their calm understatement. "That's the Japanese fleet." Commander Ernest Evans on Johnston received the report and understood immediately what it meant. Taffy 3 was about to be destroyed unless someone did something impossible. The escort carriers could not outrun Kurita's battleships. Their aircraft, armed with anti-submarine weapons and light bombs, could not sink heavy warships. The only thing standing between those carriers and annihilation was 3 destroyers, and for destroyer escorts, 7 tin cans against for battleships, 6 heavy cruisers to light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Evans did not hesitate. On his own initiative, without waiting for orders from the task group commander, he ordered Johnston to flank speed and turn toward the enemy. The decision violated every principle of tactical caution. It contradicted the doctrine that said destroyers should not engage battleships in daylight. It ignored the mathematical certainty that his ship would be destroyed. But Evans had spent 20 years in the Navy working toward this moment, and he understood something that transcended calculation. If Johnston did nothing, the carriers would die. If Johnston attacked, she would probably die, while she might buy time for the carriers to escape or launch aircraft. The choice was not between survival and death. It was between death without purpose and death that might mean something. The engagement that followed would last nearly 3 hours, and in that time the men of Taffy 3 would redefine what it meant to fight in a tin can. Johnston's attack run was suicidal by any conventional measure. The destroyer charged toward the Japanese fleet at 30 knots. Her boilers pushed to maximum pressure, black smoke pouring from her stacks. Japanese cruisers opened fire at a range of 30,000 yards. Shells the size of refrigerators began falling around Johnston, throwing up geysers of water that drenched the bridge. Evans ordered smoke generators activated and chemical fog poured from the destroyer's stern, shrouding her in a white curtain that confused Japanese rangefinders. The ship weaved and dodged, her narrow profile presenting a difficult target. In the fire control director above the bridge, sailors manually tracked Japanese vessels and fed firing solutions to the 5-inch gun mounts. At 10,000 yards, close enough that Johnston's crew could see individual details on the enemy cruisers, Evans ordered torpedoes launched. 10 Mark 15 torpedoes leaped from their tubes and ran toward the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. The enemy vessel attempted to evade, swinging hard to port, but at least one torpedo struck home. Kumano's bow was blown off. She slewed out of formation, flooding and slowing, effectively removed from the battle. It was the first blood drawn, and it sent a message to every Japanese officer watching. The tin can had teeth, but Johnston paid for her aggression. Japanese shells found her. The first hit struck aft, destroying the after gun mount and killing the crew. The second hit penetrated the engine room, rupturing steam lines and scalding the men working below. The third hit damaged the bridge, wounding Evans and destroying the ship's steering gear. Johnston slowed, trailing smoke and fire, her speed dropping from 30 knots to 17. In any other navy, at any other time, the captain would have ordered abandon ship. The destroyer was crippled, unable to maintain speed or maneuver effectively. Her survival seemed impossible. Evans ordered damage control parties below. He shifted steering to manual control aft. He kept Johnston in the fight. Around him, the other destroyers of Taffy 3 were following his example. Hull charged the Japanese line, firing her guns and launching torpedoes. Heermann attacked from a different angle, forcing Japanese cruisers to divide their fire. The destroyer escorts, smaller and even more lightly armed than the fleet destroyers, joined the attack with a courage that bordered on madness. Samuel B. Roberts, a vessel displacing barely 1,300 tons, closed to point-blank range with a Japanese cruiser and fired over 600 5-inch shells in a sustained barrage before being blown apart by return fire. The Japanese response was overwhelming in its firepower, but strangely hesitant in its execution. Kurita's fleet possessed more than enough combat power to annihilate Taffy 3 in a matter of minutes, if properly concentrated. But the aggressive attacks by American destroyers disrupted Japanese formation integrity. Battleships and cruisers were forced to maneuver to avoid torpedoes. Smoke screens laid by the destroyers and the escort carriers themselves obscured visibility and made fire control difficult. American aircraft from the escort carriers, armed with whatever ordnance they could carry, made repeated attacks on Japanese vessels. Some pilots, having expended their bombs and torpedoes, made dry runs on Japanese ships to draw anti-aircraft fire away from other aircraft. The cumulative effect was chaos, a confused melee in which Japanese advantages in firepower and armor were partially negated by the sheer audacity of American attacks. Japanese gun crews, expecting an easy victory, found themselves engaged in close-range combat with multiple targets emerging from smoke screens at unpredictable intervals. The American destroyers attacked individually without coordination, each captain making independent decisions about when to charge and when to withdraw. This violated every principle of Japanese tactical doctrine, which emphasized coordinated action and mutual support. It also made American movements nearly impossible to predict. Japanese fire control officers would track a destroyer as it emerged from smoke, calculate a firing solution, and issue orders to the gun crews. By the time the salvo landed, the destroyer had changed course and was 10 degrees off the predicted bearing. Shells fell in empty water. The American vessel disappeared back into smoke, reappeared somewhere else, launched torpedoes, and vanished again. To the Japanese sailors watching from their armored vessels, it must have seemed as though the Americans were insane. Destroyers did not behave this way. They did not charge battleships. They did not continue fighting after being hit multiple times. Yet here were these tin cans, battered and burning, still shooting, still maneuvering, still attacking. The psychological impact of this aggression was profound. Japanese officers who had spent years studying the Americans as cautious and defensive were confronted with an enemy who seemed to have no sense of self-preservation. It raised questions. If the destroyers fought with such ferocity, what would the carriers do? Were there American submarines in the area? Was this a trap? Admiral Kurita, receiving reports of torpedo attacks and airstrikes and ship damage, began to question his assessment of the tactical situation. He had expected to encounter a fleet carrier task force. The aggressive attacks by American destroyers seemed consistent with such a force. Fleet carriers would be heavily escorted, and their defenders would fight hard to protect them. But if this was indeed a major American formation, where were the fleet battleships? Where were the heavy cruisers that should be accompanying such a force? The absence of these units suggested an ambush. Perhaps American battleships were approaching from another bearing, ready to cross the T and devastate his formation once he had committed to pursuing the carriers. These doubts accumulated. At 0911, after nearly 2 hours of combat, Kurita issued an order that stunned his subordinates. The center force was to break off the attack and withdraw to the north. The order was not obeyed immediately. Some Japanese captains, engaged in gunnery duels with American destroyers, continued firing until explicitly ordered to disengage. But gradually, the Japanese fleet turned away. The largest battleships in the world, which had come within minutes of reaching firing range on the American escort carriers, steamed north and east, abandoning the attack. They had faced tin cans and flinched. The cost of that delay, those critical hours during which American destroyers hurled themselves at Japanese battleships, was measured in ships and men. Johnston, battered by dozens of shell hits, finally lost power and began to settle in the water. Evans ordered abandon ship. As the crew went over the sides, Japanese vessels continued to fire on the sinking destroyer. Evans remained on the bridge. He was last seen raising his hand in salute as Johnston rolled over and sank. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, USS Hull, her hull torn open by battleship shells, capsized and sank with heavy loss of life. USS Samuel B. Roberts, blown in half by cruiser fire, went down with her colors still flying. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, unable to escape Japanese cruisers, was pounded to wreckage and sank. More than 1,000 American sailors died in the waters off Samar, but the escort carriers escaped. The invasion fleet in Light Gulf remained intact. The Japanese center force, having withdrawn, would eventually return to Ward Light, but would accomplish nothing of strategic significance. Before retreating through San Bernardino Strait, the opportunity to inflict a catastrophic defeat on American forces was lost. It would never come again. In the calculations of strategic outcome, the battle off Samar was an American victory, achieved by forces that should have been annihilated. The surviving American sailors, pulled from oil-slicked waters hours after the battle ended, spoke of the fight with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. They had crewed tin cans. They had known from the moment they reported aboard that their ships were fragile, that a single hit could kill them, that they sailed in vessels built for economy rather than survival. And yet, when the moment came, those thin-hulled destroyers had done the impossible. They had stopped battleships, not through superior firepower or thicker armor, but through aggression so fierce and sustained that it imposed doubt on an enemy who had expected easy victory. The Japanese sailors who survived the battle told different stories. In the years after the war, when veterans gathered to discuss their experiences, former officers of the center force spoke with a kind of bewildered respect about the American destroyers they had faced. These were not the tin cans they had been led to expect. These were not the cautious, defensive vessels that Japanese doctrine had taught them to dismiss. These were warships crewed by men who fought as though they had nothing to lose, who charged into point-blank range against overwhelming odds, who absorbed punishment that should have destroyed them and kept fighting. It was a kind of courage that Japanese naval tradition could recognize and honor, even as it contradicted every assumption about American fighting quality. One Japanese officer, interviewed decades after the war, described watching an American destroyer emerge from smoke at close range, guns firing, torpedoes running, the vessel clearly damaged and listing but still underway. He said that he and his crew expected the destroyer to turn away after launching torpedoes, to seek safety in smoke and distance. Instead, the destroyer kept coming, closing the range, firing continuously. "We thought they were samurai," the officer said. "We thought they had embraced death. We did not understand Americans could fight that way." This was the transformation that Samar represented. The Japanese had laughed at American destroyers, had called them tin cans, had expected them to flee or die without resistance. Instead, they had encountered men who redefined what those fragile vessels could accomplish. The thin hulls became irrelevant. The lack of armor ceased to matter. What mattered was the willingness to fight, to charge toward certain destruction, because the alternative was to let the enemy win. Without contest, the mathematics of naval warfare, so carefully calculated and refined over decades of study, proved insufficient to account for the human factor. Courage multiplied effectiveness beyond what tonnage and armor plate could predict. Throughout the desperate hours of battle, one element recurred in the experience of American sailors: the steady stream of supplies that kept their guns firing. Ammunition was passed up from magazines by human chains, shells weighing 50 pounds each, handed from man to man with mechanical efficiency. The 5-inch guns of Johnston fired over 800 rounds during the engagement, a rate of fire that required constant replenishment of the ready lockers around each mount. Men below decks worked in near darkness, lit only by red battle lamps, sweat pouring down their faces as they manhandled shells from storage racks to ammunition hoists. They worked through hits that shook the ship, through fires and flooding, through the screaming of wounded and the constant thunder of gunfire. And the ammunition kept coming. This abundance was not an accident. It was the product of an industrial system that the Japanese had never been able to replicate. American factories produced ammunition in quantities that seemed almost wasteful by Japanese standards, where Japanese destroyers carefully rationed their shells, knowing that resupply was uncertain and production limited. American destroyers loaded magazines to capacity and beyond, stacking shells in passageways and ready lockers because they knew that more could be obtained at any forward base. The 5-inch shells that Johnston's crew fired so prodigiously that morning off Samar had been manufactured in plants scattered across the continental United States. produced by workers who would never see the ocean, shipped thousands of miles across the Pacific in cargo vessels, and distributed to ammunition ships that serviced destroyers at anchorages throughout the theater. This logistical reality represented a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached war. Japanese industry could build magnificent individual vessels, could craft 18-inch guns of incredible precision, could produce torpedoes that outperformed anything in the American arsenal, but they could not build enough of them. By 1944, Japanese ammunition production was constrained by shortages of raw materials, by the destruction of factories through American bombing, by the interdiction of shipping lanes that prevented movement of supplies from occupied territories. Japanese destroyers went into battle with magazines only partially filled, because there was no guarantee they could be replenished. American destroyers went into battle with every available space crammed with ammunition, because the supply was effectively unlimited. This difference manifested in tactics. Japanese destroyers were trained to make their shots count, to carefully aim each salvo, to conserve ammunition for decisive moments. American destroyers were trained to shoot fast and shoot often, to saturate target areas with fire, to keep shooting until the enemy was destroyed or the magazines were empty. The American approach was wasteful by Japanese standards, inefficient, reflective of a nation that valued quantity over quality. But in practice, it meant that American destroyers could sustain rates of fire that Japanese vessels could not match. It meant that American gun crews could blaze away at targets obscured by smoke, could fire at suspected positions rather than confirmed targets, could maintain continuous fire for hours rather than minutes. The shells themselves told a story about American industrial philosophy. They were mass-produced, stamped and machined in automated processes that prioritized speed of manufacture over individual perfection. Quality control was sufficient rather than exceptional. Some shells were duds, some failed to detonate properly, but the vast majority worked as designed, and there were so many of them that individual failures hardly mattered. This was the opposite of Japanese manufacturing philosophy, which emphasized craftsmanship and precision. Japanese shells were produced in smaller numbers, but to higher individual standards. In a perfect world, this approach would have been superior. In the actual world of 1944, where Japan was losing its industrial base and America was expanding its own, the American approach proved decisive. The men who loaded and fired those shells understood this at some level, even if they could not articulate it in strategic terms. They knew that the ammunition they were firing had been produced in quantities that boggled imagination, that back home in America there were factories running 3 shifts a day, turning out shells and propellant and fuses at rates measured in thousands per day. They knew that the industrial might of the United States stood behind them, invisible, but present in every shell that left a gun barrel. It was a kind of faith, a trust in the systems that supplied them. They did not have to carefully husband their ammunition because they knew more would come. This freedom from logistical anxiety allowed them to fight differently, to be more aggressive, to take risks that Japanese destroyers, operating on the edge of logistical sustainability, could not afford. The battle off Samar ended, but its implications rippled outward through both navies. For the Americans, it became a touchstone of destroyer doctrine, a validation of aggressive tactics and the effectiveness of mass-produced vessels, crewed by well-trained sailors. The after-action reports were studied at naval academies and staff colleges. The tactics employed by Johnston, Hull, and Harriman became textbook examples of how to fight against superior forces. Future generations of American naval officers would be taught to emulate the aggression, an initiative displayed by Commander Evans and his fellow captains. The battle proved that American destroyers, despite their thin hulls and light armament, could achieve decisive results through audacity and determination. For the Japanese, Samar represented a kind of psychological fracture. The battle confirmed what many officers had begun to suspect, that American industrial power had fundamentally altered the mathematics of naval warfare. The ability to build destroyers faster than they could be sunk, to produce ammunition in quantities that permitted sustained high-rate fire, to replace losses almost immediately, meant that Japan could not win a war of attrition. The courage and skill of Japanese sailors could not compensate for the material disadvantage. Every Japanese vessel lost was irreplaceable. Every American vessel lost was replaced by 2 more. The destroyers that the Japanese had dismissed as tin cans had revealed themselves to be components of a system that was, in aggregate, unstoppable. Japanese naval doctrine had been built on the assumption of qualitative superiority. Better ships, better trained crews. Better tactics would allow the Imperial Navy to defeat larger American forces. Indecisive engagements. This assumption had been tested and found wanting. At Midway, Japanese carriers had been sunk by American dive bombers flown by pilots with relatively limited training. In the Solomons, Japanese destroyers had fought American destroyers to a standstill in night battles where American radar negated Japanese optical advantages. At Samar, Japanese battleships had been driven off by American destroyers that should have been destroyed. In the opening minutes of combat, the pattern was clear. American quantity and American industrial power had become a form of quality that Japanese craftsmanship and Japanese fighting spirit could not overcome. This realization demoralized the Japanese officer corps more profoundly than any tactical defeat. It suggested that the war was unwinnable, that no amount of sacrifice or courage could alter the outcome. Japanese destroyers continued to fight with skill and determination throughout the remaining months of the war, but the sense of inevitable defeat permeated the fleet. Officers who had once believed in the possibility of victory through superior tactics now understood that they were participants in a losing struggle. The tin cans had proven that American material power, combined with the willingness of American sailors to fight aggressively, created a combination that could not be defeated by traditional naval methods. The escort carriers of Taffy III, having survived the battle, continued their assigned missions supporting the invasion of light. Their aircraft flew close air support for American ground forces, attacked Japanese shipping, and provided anti-submarine patrols. The routine nature of these operations stood in strange contrast to the morning's desperate action. Pilots who had made dummy runs on Japanese battleships now bombed supply depots and strafed truck convoys. The carriers steamed in formation, recovering and launching aircraft, their crews working with the practiced efficiency of men performing familiar tasks. But at night, in the ready rooms and mess decks, sailors talked about what they had witnessed. They had seen destroyers charge battleships. They had seen tin cans fight as though they were capital ships. They had seen men die to buy time for others to live. These conversations reflected a deeper understanding of what had happened off Samar. The battle had not been won through superior technology or better weapons. It had been won through the willingness of men to act in ways that transcended rational calculation. Commander Evans and his fellow captains had made decisions that no tactical doctrine could have predicted or prescribed. They had chosen to fight not because fighting offered hope of survival, but because fighting was the only option consistent with their oaths and their sense of duty. This was not Bushido, not the Japanese code of death before dishonor. This was something distinctly American, a pragmatic heroism rooted in democratic values. The sailors of Taffy III had fought to protect their comrades, to complete their mission, to do their jobs. They had not sought glorious death. They had sought to accomplish their objective and survive. When survival proved incompatible with mission accomplishment, they chose mission accomplishment. This distinction mattered. Japanese doctrine emphasized the spiritual dimension of combat, the importance of fighting spirit and willingness to die. American doctrine emphasized mission accomplishment and the protection of one's comrades. Both approaches could produce extraordinary courage, but they produced different types of courage. Japanese sailors would fight to the death to avoid the shame of surrender. American sailors would fight to the death to protect their friends and complete their assigned tasks. The outcomes might appear similar, men dying in combat, but the motivations were fundamentally different. And in the waters off Samar, the American approach had proven effective beyond any reasonable expectation. The destroyer as symbol evolved in those hours of battle. The tin can, once an object of mockery or at best affectionate dismissal, became emblematic of American naval power, not the individual vessel, which remained fragile ere Triscontin vulnerable, but the vessel as part of a system that could build them by the hundreds, crew them with trained sailors from a democratic society, supply them with ammunition and fuel and spare parts, and send them into combat knowing that losses could be replaced. The Japanese had laughed at the tin cans because they saw only the individual ships, thin-hulled and lightly armed. They had failed to see the industrial and social infrastructure that stood behind those ships, the factories and training centers and supply depots that made each destroyer not an isolated unit, but a component of something vastly larger. The systemic perspective was quintessentially American. The United States had entered the war with a relatively small navy and had built it into the largest maritime force in history through industrial mobilization on a scale unprecedented in human affairs. Destroyers were mass-produced using techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. Welding replaced riveting because welding was faster. Standardized components allowed for rapid construction and simplified maintenance. Entire classes of vessels shared identical blueprints, which meant that spare parts were interchangeable and sailors could transfer between ships with minimal retraining. This approach offended traditionalists who believed that each ship should be individually crafted to maximize its particular strengths, but it proved devastatingly effective in practice. The men who crewed these mass-produced vessels brought their own distinctly American characteristics to naval warfare. They were not professional sailors in the Japanese or British sense, men who had joined the Navy as teenagers and spent decades learning their trade. They were civilians in uniform, drafted or enlisted for the duration of the war, trained intensively for a few months, and then sent to sea. They brought with them the skills and attitudes of American civilian life: mechanical aptitude, from working on cars and farm equipment, initiative from growing up in a society that valued individual problem-solving, skepticism toward rigid hierarchy, a tendency to improvise solutions rather than follow procedures exactly. These characteristics sometimes frustrated regular Navy officers who expected stricter discipline and more formal adherence to protocol, but they proved invaluable in combat. When Johnston lost steering control from the bridge, sailors aft rigged manual steering without waiting for orders. When ammunition hoists jammed, men formed human chains to pass shells by hand. When fire control systems were damaged, gun crews switched to local control and continued firing using optical sights. These were not actions prescribed in training manuals. They were improvised responses by men who understood their equipment and their mission, and refused to accept that damage to one system meant the entire ship was combatant effective. This adaptability, this refusal to give up, reflected something fundamental about American culture in the 1940s: a can-do pragmatism that treated obstacles as problems to be solved rather than as excuses for failure. In the months following the Battle off Samar, Japanese naval intelligence officers compiled reports attempting to explain what had happened. The raw facts were indisputable. A superior Japanese force had failed to destroy an inferior American force, had in fact been driven off by aggressive attacks from vessels that should have been incapable of threatening battleships. The explanations offered were varied. Some officers emphasized the effectiveness of American air attacks, noting that the constant harassment by carrier aircraft had disrupted Japanese formation integrity and forced capital ships to maneuver defensively. This was true but insufficient. The air attacks had been dangerous but not decisive. No Japanese battleship or heavy cruiser had been sunk by aircraft during the battle. Other officers emphasized the tactical confusion caused by American smoke screens and the aggressive attacks by destroyers. They noted that the destroyer attacks had forced the center force to spread out to avoid torpedoes, which had made it difficult for Admiral Kurita to maintain tactical control. This explanation was closer to the mark, but it still failed to fully account for why experienced Japanese officers had been so thoroughly disrupted by tactics that were, in retrospect, not particularly sophisticated. American destroyers had charged and launched torpedoes. They had laid smoke. They had fired their guns at maximum rate. None of this was novel or unexpected. Japanese doctrine specifically addressed how to deal with destroyer attacks, and yet the attacks had worked. The most perceptive Japanese officers, writing years after the war, identified the real issue. The American destroyers had fought with an intensity and aggression that Japanese doctrine had not anticipated, because that doctrine was based on assumptions about American morale and fighting spirit that proved false. The Japanese had expected American destroyers to fight cautiously, to withdraw when seriously threatened, to prioritize survival over mission accomplishment. These expectations were rooted in racial prejudices and cultural misunderstandings. Japanese officers believed that Americans, coming from a democratic and materialistic society, lacked the spiritual foundation necessary for sustained self-sacrifice in combat. They believed that American sailors fought for pay and material comfort, not for honor or duty, and would therefore avoid unnecessary risk. The Battle off Samar shattered these assumptions so completely that some Japanese officers simply refused to accept what had happened. In their minds, the American destroyers must have been crewed by specially selected elite forces, perhaps Marines or specially trained volunteers, not ordinary sailors. The alternative, that regular American sailors, drawn from civilian life and trained for a few months, could fight with such ferocity was too psychologically destabilizing to accept. It suggested that everything Japanese naval doctrine taught about the correlation between fighting spirit and cultural background was wrong. It suggested that democracy, which Japanese militarists had dismissed as weak and decadent, could produce men capable of extraordinary courage. This realization had implications beyond naval tactics. If ordinary Americans could fight as fiercely as samurai, if mass-produced vessels crewed by citizen soldiers could defeat elite forces in carefully crafted warships, then the entire ideological framework that justified Japanese militarism was suspect. The war had been sold to the Japanese people as a struggle between Japanese spiritual superiority and Western material decadence. Every defeat could be explained as temporary, the result of American material advantages that Japanese spirit would eventually overcome. But Samar suggested something different. It suggested that the Americans possessed both material superiority and fighting spirit equal to anything Japan could field. This combination was unbeatable. The symbolic power of the destroyer was not lost on American war correspondents and propagandists. The story of Taffy 3 appeared in newspapers across the United States within weeks of the battle. It was simplified and dramatized for public consumption, but the essential narrative remained true. Outnumbered destroyers had fought battleships and won. The Tenkan sailors became heroes, exemplars of American courage and determination. Their story fit perfectly into the broader narrative of American exceptionalism that sustained public support for the war. Here were ordinary men, sailors from small towns and big cities, who had faced impossible odds and prevailed through courage and ingenuity. They were not supermen. They were Americans, which in the propaganda framework of 1944 amounted to the same thing. But the men who had actually fought the battle knew the story was more complicated. They knew that luck had played a role, that if Japanese gunnery had been more accurate or if Admiral Kurita had pressed his attack for another hour, Taffy 3 would have been annihilated. They knew that their survival was purchased with the lives of shipmates who had gone down with Johnston and Hull and Samuel B. Roberts. They knew that heroism and tragedy were intertwined, that victory and defeat were separated by margins so thin as to be almost meaningless. In the survivor communities that formed after the war, men who had been pulled from the oil-slicked waters off Samar spoke of the battle with a complex mixture of pride and survivor's guilt. They had done something extraordinary, but they had done it at a cost that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The destroyers themselves, or rather the survivors among them, continued to serve. Heermann remained in commission through the end of the war, participating in the invasion of Okinawa and the final naval operations against Japan. Her crew maintained the ship with the meticulous care of men who understood how fragile their vessel was, how thin the line between survival and destruction. Every rivet and weld became significant, every piece of equipment a potential lifesaver. The ship herself became a kind of shrine to the men who had fought her at Samar, a floating memorial to what tin cans could accomplish in Japanese ports. The survivors of the Center Force returned to a nation that could no longer deny its impending defeat. The battleship Yamato, which had turned away from combat with American destroyers, would sail one last time in April 1945, sent on a suicide mission to Okinawa with only enough fuel for a one-way trip. She would be sunk by American carrier aircraft before reaching her destination, her massive guns never firing at the invasion fleet she had been sent to destroy. The symbolism was inescapable. The largest battleship ever built, the pinnacle of Japanese naval architecture, destroyed by aircraft from carriers protected by destroyers. The progression from Samar to Yamato's final sortie represented the complete vindication of American naval doctrine and the absolute failure of Japanese assumptions about how the war would be fought. The technical lessons of Samar were incorporated into post-war destroyer design, but the real legacy was doctrinal. American naval officers studying the battle concluded that aggressive tactics, even when tactically disadvantageous, could produce strategic results by imposing psychological pressure on the enemy. The willingness to close to point-blank range, to accept damage in exchange for opportunities to inflict damage, to fight until sinking rather than withdraw. These became hallmarks of American destroyer doctrine during the Cold War. The Tenkan sailors of Taffy 3 had established a standard that future generations of destroyer crews would be expected to meet. This standard was demanding in ways that went beyond technical proficiency. It required a kind of moral courage that could not be trained or instilled through discipline alone. It required men to make decisions that might result in their deaths, to continue fighting when every rational impulse urged withdrawal, to trust that their sacrifice would serve some larger purpose. In peacetime, such demands seemed abstract, theoretical. In combat, they became immediate and personal. The officers and sailors who studied the battle off Samar understood that they were being asked to emulate men who had done the impossible, and that understanding created a burden of expectation that shaped American naval culture for decades. The destroyer escorts that had fought alongside the fleet destroyers presented their own lessons. These vessels were even smaller and more lightly armed than destroyers. Designed primarily for convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare, their crews were often reservists and newly trained sailors, men with minimal sea experience. Yet Samuel B. Roberts had fought with a ferocity that matched any fleet destroyer, had closed to point-blank range with Japanese cruisers and traded salvos, until she was blown in half. Her crew had included men who had never been to sea before joining the Navy, farm boys and store clerks who learned gunnery and damage control in a few weeks of training. They had no tradition of naval service to draw upon, no generational legacy of seamanship. They had only their training, their shipmates, and their sense of duty, and it had been enough. This was perhaps the most subversive lesson of Samar from the Japanese perspective. The Americans had proven that a democratic society, drawing its sailors from a civilian population with no particular martial tradition, could produce fighting men equal to any professional military force. The Japanese had built their military power on a foundation of hierarchical discipline and warrior traditions stretching back centuries. They had created an officer corps educated in the virtues of Bushido, and enlisted ranks indoctrinated with absolute obedience to authority. And they had been fought to a standstill by men who questioned orders, who improvised solutions, who valued individual initiative over rigid discipline. The implications were devastating. If democracy could produce warriors as effective as those created by militarism, then militarism had no advantage. It had only cost the suppression of individual freedom, the elimination of dissent, the reduction of citizens to instruments of state power. In the decades after the war, survivors of both sides met occasionally at reunions and historical conferences. These meetings were awkward, haunted by memories of men killed and ships sunk, but they were also opportunities for understanding. Japanese veterans spoke with respect about the American destroyers they had faced, acknowledged the courage of men who had fought in vessels that offered minimal protection against the weapons they faced. American veterans acknowledged the power and sophistication of Japanese warships, the skill of Japanese gun crews, and the accuracy of Japanese fire control. There was a mutual recognition that both sides had fought with honor, that the battle had been decided not by cowardice or incompetence, but by factors beyond the control of individual sailors. But beneath this mutual respect lay a divergence in how the battle was remembered and understood. For American veterans, Samar represented a validation of democratic values, proof that free men fighting for a just cause could prevail against authoritarian aggression. For Japanese veterans, it represented the futility of courage in the face of overwhelming material power, a demonstration that spiritual superiority could not compensate for industrial weakness. These interpretations were not mutually exclusive, but they reflected different cultural frameworks for understanding victory and defeat. Americans saw Samar as evidence that their system worked, that democracy produced effective warriors and industrial abundance provided the tools for victory. Japanese saw it as evidence that their system had failed, that spiritual training and warrior tradition were insufficient against an enemy who possessed both material superiority and adequate fighting spirit. The truth, as always, was more complex than either narrative allowed. The battle had been decided by human decisions made under extreme stress, by the willingness of men to fight beyond the point of reason, by luck and weather and the thousand small factors that determine combat outcomes. Commander Evans's decision to charge the Japanese fleet was not the product of American democracy or industrial abundance. It was the product of a single man's character, his particular combination of courage and tactical judgment and sense of duty. The fact that his crew followed him, that they fought the ship until she sank, reflected something about American naval training and culture. But it also reflected something universal about human beings under stress. Men fight for their comrades, for their immediate leaders, for their sense of who they are. National ideology and strategic doctrine matter, but in the moment of combat, they recede behind more immediate concerns. The tin can, in the end, was just a ship, steel plates welded together. machinery and weapons and living spaces crammed into a hole barely 300 feet long. It had no intrinsic meaning, no ideological significance, but the men who crewed it invested it with meaning through their actions. They transformed the tin can from a disposable escort vessel into something that symbolized courage, sacrifice, and the refusal to accept defeat. This transformation was not unique to American destroyers. Japanese destroyers fought with equal courage in defense of their convoys and battle groups. British destroyers charged German battleships in the North Atlantic. Every navy that fought in the Second World War had its destroyer heroes, its tin can sailors who exceeded every reasonable expectation of what lightly armed vessels could accomplish. What made Samar unique was not the courage of its participants, but the strategic context in which that courage was displayed. The battle occurred at a moment when the outcome of the Pacific War had already been decided by American industrial power and Japanese logistical collapse. But when individual actions could still affect tactical outcomes, the American destroyers could not alter the fact that Japan was losing the war, but they could save the lives of thousands of American sailors aboard the escort carriers and prevent the destruction of the invasion fleet in Light Gulf. Their sacrifice had tactical and operational significance precisely because the strategic situation was already determined. This gave their actions a peculiar poignancy. They fought not to change the war's outcome, but to save their comrades and complete their mission in a war that was already won. The escort carriers that survived Samar continued to operate through the final months of the war, but they would face one more trial that tested the courage of their crews in ways different from surface combat. In the weeks following the battle, Japanese forces began employing kamikaze tactics. Suicide attacks by aircraft deliberately crashed into American ships. The escort carriers, slow and unarmored, were vulnerable to these attacks in ways that even battleship gunfire had not made them. On October 25, 1944, the same day as the battle off Samar, the escort carrier St. Lo was struck by a kamikaze aircraft and sank within minutes. Other carriers of Taffy 3 were damaged by kamikaze attacks in the following days. The psychological impact of kamikaze attacks was different from conventional combat. There was no possibility of deterring an attacker who had already committed to dying. No amount of anti-aircraft fire, no evasive maneuvering, could guarantee survival against an enemy who accepted certain death as the price of inflicting damage. American sailors, who had fought with pragmatic courage against overwhelming odds, now faced an enemy whose tactical doctrine explicitly embraced suicide. It was disturbing in ways that conventional combat was not, because it challenged American assumptions about the rationality of warfare. Americans could understand fighting to the death in defense of one's ship or comrades. They could respect courage even in enemies, but deliberate suicide as a tactical weapon seemed to come from a different moral universe, one in which individual life had no value beyond its utility to the state. The destroyer sailors who had survived Samar now found themselves screening carriers against kamikaze attacks, using their anti-aircraft guns to shoot down suicide planes before they could reach their targets. It was a different kind of battle, one that required vigilance rather than aggression, defensive positioning rather than offensive charges. But it drew on the same fundamental courage. The destroyers placed themselves between the carriers and the attacking aircraft, deliberately making themselves targets to protect the larger vessels. Sailors who had charged battleships now stood at anti-aircraft directors, tracking incoming planes, firing until the guns overheated, watching comrades die when the planes got through. The symbolism of the tin can evolved again. It became not just the aggressive attacker, but the protective shield, the vessel that accepted damage so that others might survive. This protective role reflected a fundamental aspect of destroyer doctrine that the aggressive action at Samar had sometimes obscured. Destroyers existed to protect other vessels' carriers, battleships, transports. Their offensive capabilities were important, but their primary mission was defensive. The charge against Kurita's battleships had been an offensive action undertaken for a defensive purpose, to prevent the destruction of the escort carriers. The anti-kamikaze patrols were purely defensive, but they required the same willingness to accept risk that the offensive action had demanded. In both cases, the destroyer and her crew stood between danger and those they were charged to protect. The metal hull, thin and vulnerable, became a barrier purchased with human courage. The war ended in August 1945, and the surviving destroyers of Taffy 3 returned to the United States to be decommissioned or reassigned. their crews dispersed, returning to civilian life with memories that would shape them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke freely about their experiences. Others kept silent, finding that the words available to them were insufficient to convey what they had lived through. The gap between civilian experience and combat experience seemed unbridgeable. How could someone who had never been in combat understand what it meant to charge a battleship? In a tin can? How could the terror and exhilaration and exhaustion of battle be translated into language? That made sense in peacetime. The Navy recognized the significance of what had happened off Samar. Commander Evans received the Medal of Honor. Other officers and sailors received Navy crosses, silver stars, bronze stars. These decorations acknowledged exceptional courage, but they could not capture the totality of what the battle had demonstrated. Awards for valor were individual recognitions, but the lesson of Samar was collective. It was about what groups of men could accomplish when led effectively and trained thoroughly, about what institutions could achieve when they aligned individual courage with organizational purpose. The Fletcher-class destroyers, the most numerous class of destroyers built by any nation during the war, became the standard against which all post-war destroyer designs were measured. Some remained in service through the Korean War and beyond, modernized with new radar and weapons, but retaining the basic hull and machinery that had proven so effective in World War II. The tin can had become a classic, a design so successful that it defined a generation of naval architecture. Future destroyers would be larger and more heavily armed, equipped with guided missiles and advanced electronics. But they would trace their lineage back to the Fletchers that had fought at Samar Da in Japan. The surviving ships of the Center Force were scrapped under the terms of the peace treaty. Yamato's sister ship Shinano, converted to an aircraft carrier, had been sunk by an American submarine before ever seeing combat. The third planned vessel of the class was never completed. The battleship as a type was obsolete, rendered irrelevant by the carrier warfare that had dominated the Pacific conflict. But the symbolic power of Yamato and her sisters persisted in Japanese memory. They represented the peak of Japanese naval architecture and the futility of that achievement. The largest battleships ever built, driven off by destroyers 1/30th their size. The irony was bitter and inescapable. Japanese naval veterans, writing memoirs and histories in the decades after the war, returned again and again to the question of what had gone wrong. The Center Force had possessed overwhelming firepower. Its crews were experienced professionals. Its mission was clear, yet it had failed. Some blamed Admiral Kurita for indecision. Others blamed inadequate intelligence about American force composition. Still others blamed the cumulative effects of air attacks and torpedo damage sustained on the approach to light. But the most thoughtful analyses acknowledged that the fundamental problem was psychological. The Americans had fought with an aggression that Japanese doctrine had not predicted, and for which Japanese tactical responses were inadequate. The tin cans had imposed their will on battleships through the sheer audacity of their attacks. The legacy of Samar extended beyond naval tactics into broader questions about democracy and warfare. The battle seemed to validate the American belief that free societies could fight effectively, that citizen soldiers drawn from civilian life could match professional military forces in combat. This was not a new idea. The American Revolution had been fought largely by militia and short-term volunteers, and the Civil War had been fought by mass armies of civilians in uniform. But Samar demonstrated that the principle applied to modern industrial warfare, that complex weapon systems could be operated effectively by men with limited military backgrounds, that initiative and flexibility could compensate for lack of professional military training. This validation of democratic military power had Cold War implications. In the ideological competition with the Soviet Union, the United States positioned itself as the defender of freedom against totalitarian aggression. The story of Samar fit perfectly into this narrative. It demonstrated that free men could fight as effectively as those indoctrinated by authoritarian systems, that democratic societies could produce warriors who matched or exceeded anything military dictatorships could feel. The tin can sailors became exemplars of democratic courage, proof that liberty and military effectiveness were compatible. But the reality was more nuanced. The men who had fought at Samar were products of a specific American culture. At a specific historical moment, they came of age during the Depression in a society that valued self-reliance and practical skills. They joined the Navy or were drafted into it at a time when the war's purpose seemed clear: stopping fascist aggression, defending freedom, protecting the homeland. Their willingness to fight and die was not simply a product of democratic values. It was rooted in a complex combination of patriotism, peer pressure, training, leadership, and the particular circumstances of their time and place. Later generations of American sailors would face different enemies in different contexts, and their responses would reflect different circumstances. What remained constant was the symbolic power of the destroyer. Throughout the Cold War and beyond, the destroyer retained its place in American naval culture as the embodiment of aggressive, offensive-minded warfare. Destroyers were fast, versatile, capable of operating independently or as part of larger formations. They were still lightly armored compared to cruisers or battleships, still vulnerable to heavy weapons, but they were also still the vessels that charged into harm's way, that placed themselves between danger and those they protected, that fought above their weight class when circumstances demanded. The tradition established at Samar, the tradition of the Tin Can sailors, became part of the institutional identity of the destroyer force. In the 21st century, destroyers would evolve into guided missile platforms equipped with sophisticated radar and computer systems, capable of engaging targets at distances measured in hundreds of miles. They bore little physical resemblance to the Fletcher-class destroyers of World War II, but the sailors who crewed them understood that they were heirs to a tradition, that they served in vessels whose identity had been forged in the waters off Samar. The Tin Can had become something more than a ship type. It had become an ideal, a standard of courage and aggression and willingness to fight against overwhelming odds. The sea remembers nothing. The waters off Samar are empty now, crossed by fishing boats and cargo vessels that pass unknowing over the wrecks 3 miles below. Johnston rests on the bottom, her hull broken, her guns silent, her crew long gone. The men who fought her are mostly gone too, their stories preserved in official histories and memoirs and fading memories. But what they did endures. It endures in the naval doctrine that studies their tactics. It endures in the tradition of the destroyer force. It endures in the understanding that courage and determination can alter outcomes that seem predetermined by material factors. The Japanese who laughed at American tin cans learned something important off Samar. Though the lesson came too late to alter the war's outcome, they learned that contempt is a dangerous indulgence in warfare, that underestimating an enemy's willingness to fight can prove fatal, regardless of comparative firepower. They learned that the human factor in combat cannot be calculated in advance, that men will sometimes fight beyond any reasonable expectation, and that when they do, they can achieve the impossible. These were lessons purchased at the cost of Japanese lives as well as American, paid for in blood and steel and shattered ships, but more broadly, Samar demonstrated something about the nature of democratic warfare that would resonate through the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. It showed that free societies, when threatened, could mobilize not just their industrial resources, but their human resources in ways that matched or exceeded anything authoritarian systems could achieve. The Tin Can sailors were not supermen. They were not professional warriors trained from youth in the arts of war. They were ordinary Americans, citizens in uniform, who rose to an extraordinary challenge because their training, their leadership, and their values prepared them to do so. They fought for their country, but more immediately they fought for each other, for their shipmates, for the simple human obligation to do one's job and protect one's friends. This was the fury that the Japanese faced when they encountered the Tin Cans off Samar, not the fury of professional killers or ideological fanatics, but the fury of ordinary men pushed beyond their limits and refusing to break. It was a fury rooted in the particular character of American democratic culture: pragmatic, improvisational, skeptical of rigid hierarchy, but capable of extraordinary discipline when the situation demanded it. It was the fury of men who understood that their survival mattered less than their mission, who calculated the odds and decided to fight anyway, who sailed into certain destruction because someone had to and they were the ones present. At the moment of crisis, the destroyers they commanded were indeed tin cans, fragile and vulnerable, built cheap and built fast, but in the hands of men willing to fight beyond reason. Those tin cans became instruments of strategic consequence. They stopped battleships. They saved the invasion fleet. They wrote a chapter in naval history that would be remembered as long as navies sailed, and men studied the art of war at sea. The laugh died in Japanese throats, replaced by respect hard-earned and dearly bought. The tin cans had revealed their fury, and the revelation changed everything.